I'm very pleased to say that we're now moving on to our next speaker, who's kindly agreed to talk today. That's Nicky Murdoch. I'll be showing her slides here. Nicky is the independent chair on the Public and Patient Voices at NHS England. We do quite a lot of work with Nicky, and I'm really pleased that she's able to share that with us today. So welcome, Nicky, and floor's all yours.
Thank you, Kate. As Kate's already mentioned, I work very closely with NHS England Armed Forces team in a non-executive director role as the independent chair for the Armed Forces Public Patient Voice Group. And I'm going to talk a bit about that today, but just for some context, I am an Army veteran. I served for 30 years in the Army, initially with the Women's Royal Army Corps, and subsequently, when that disbanded in 1992, with the Adjutant General's Corps, which is the sort of Army's HR branch. I left after I had breast cancer, not because I was medically discharged, but it refocused my priorities, I guess, in life. And I did a program that, before I left the Army, that looked after what would now be called the wounded, injured and sick cohort, who'd been injured in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early years. And there was no recovery capability across defence at that time. So I ran a programme with a youth education charity called Skillforce to get people with injury and illness back into the mindset of work, whether that was returning to the military or transitioning out. And I really enjoyed that. And that led me to apply for a job, and I became the chief executive of the Defence Medical Welfare Service that provides, to this day, an excellent service to the armed forces community and their families when they're in hospital. So I did that for 7 years, and that introduced me to the NHS and what it did, and the close working relationship that the military charity sector has with NHS England. And that led me into this role, which I've been doing now for 4 years. And in addition to that, I'm also a member of the government's Veterans Advisory Board. So I have a sort of foot in both camps, if you will, on looking at what the governments are doing in order to support veterans and their family, but also with the NHS, who are clearly the lead providers in supporting healthcare needs for the entire armed forces community. So this afternoon, what I'd like to do is talk a bit, if I may, about the Armed Forces Public Patient Voice Group, how it's configured, who's in it, and what it does. And then talk about some of the things that NHS England is doing in response to the needs of women. And you've already heard from Lauren about some of the things that have been identified, but there's quite a lot of work being done. And what we've got to do is make sure that we publicise what is being done, so that it's accurate information, because I think probably all of us on this call know that there can be some quite grumpy and negative comments about the provision for the armed forces community, and some of that could be dispelled if we promoted and marketed more effectively what is being done. So, Kate, if I may look at the first slide that I've got to talk about the Armed Forces Public Patient Voice Group at a glance. And the PPV function is something that is required by law for the NHS to consult with patient groups in all the services that they commission. And so for the armed forces, we put lived experience at the centre of the Armed Forces Work Programme, and all our NHS colleagues are very keen to ensure that they develop and design their services with the patient in mind. And that is a really important factor in the work that we do with them together. But our role really is, and if you look at the top left-hand box, is the role of critical friend. So it is bringing to the attention of the Armed Forces team issues that affect the Armed Forces community, whether they're serving members, veterans, reservists, or any of their family members, because there are specific things that impact our community. It's also being an advisor and an advocate, and quite often people who are from the armed forces who don't know where to go because of some of the limitations that Lauren identified in her research. You know, they don't know where to go to best access the support that exists, if they know it exists at all. So quite often my group will be approached by someone in their networks or someone who's vulnerable, and we will be advocating on their behalf to get them to the right place. I've touched on the business of communicator. It is an enduring theme, and I think in the public sector there needs to be a higher priority placed on really marketing what is out there, as opposed to a slightly more defensive stance, because there is an awful lot of good out there, but it's a complex area and we need to make sure that we get the message out there accurately. And I think the final bit of the role we have is about assurance, assuring the Armed Forces community, assuring the NHS that they're on track with what's required to meet the healthcare needs of the community. And the way that the Public Patient Voice Group has been able to influence the work programme for NHS England Armed Forces is by conducting all the activity in the left-hand slide and raising issues that affect the community and the key areas on top of what they already do for the Armed Forces community have allowed us to look at and commission and fund research for the BAME community, including our Commonwealth soldiers that have different terms and conditions, for female veterans, and you've heard from Lauren on that, supporting Fighting with Pride, a new charity for the LGBT community, of which I'm a part, and also families. A very big part of the Armed Forces community is families, and there's an expectation, I think, for anyone who's ever served, that the military places demands on military spouses that probably don't exist anywhere else, and so the importance of the family is given equal billing in the Armed Forces team. Clearly, I have to make sure that my PPV groups cut across all of the different elements of society. So we have representatives of the serving community, the reservist community, veterans and their families across all three services to make sure that their different needs are cross-cut around what we do. If you come to the bottom left of this slide, we have sort of three sets of groupings, if you like. So we have the expert advisors group, which is made up of organisations including the Ministry of Defence, the People and the Surgeon General's Department. We have the Families Federations to reflect exactly what I've just said about the importance of families, expert charities and individuals who've got lived experience of being ill and injured in treatment in the NHS system, which, as we know, we start off as citizens before we join the military. We have our time in the military and then we transition out, become citizens again. And it's important that we all understand that, particularly the military community, because sometimes I think we think we're a bit exclusive in that regard, but actually we do get serviced by the NHS throughout our lives, whether it's dentistry or ophthalmology or cancer services. So it's really important that we understand the NHS and what it provides for us. And then in order to make sure that all of the sort of types of injury and illness are included across different conflicts, we have the lived experience group. And I know all of you will appreciate that we've had a lot of exposure because of the nature of society today on Iraq and Afghanistan, but we need to make sure that we pick up other conflicts such as the Balkans, which was a particularly difficult conflict and sometimes gets forgotten, and Northern Ireland and the Falkland Islands. All of those conflicts are represented in our lived experience group, and not just conflict, but those who have served throughout time, where perhaps we were engaged in Germany for a very long time, where we were expecting the Russians to come over the inner German border. So all of those experiences are reflected in our lived experience group. And as I say, that cross-cuts across the three services to encapture their different challenges. And the final group really is a group of registered stakeholders, so people with an absolute interest in the armed forces community who register through the NHS website to receive updates and briefings on all the activities that NHS England are involved in for the armed forces community. I've just done a little graph there because data is king as ever, to show the breakdown of people that we have in the group. And the final point really is just to make sure that everybody's aware, I'm sure many of you on this call will be, but of the variety of initiatives that have been put in place by the NHS for our community. The Veterans Trauma Network is in play and has been since 2016. The Veterans Covenant Healthcare Alliance, Operation Courage, which is the Veterans Mental Health and Wellbeing Service, a suite of services ranging from TILS and CTS to the High Intensity Service. So a range of things to meet different needs. And then GP friendly practices, so initiatives to raise awareness and understanding of the armed forces community and its healthcare needs. So there's really quite a lot going on, and it's all really quite positive. And most veterans, most members of the community that transition really effectively. And so it's important that we have services that will meet everybody's needs, including the most vulnerable. And that's exactly why Operation Courage has been developed as a suite of services. So there's a lot going on, and actually it's really quite positive. We just need to make sure that people are aware of it and that we market it effectively. And if we could move to my next slide, this is really my sort of internal document about what our intent is over the coming 2 to 3 years for the PPV group as part of its work with NHS England, who clearly are complying with the NHS England long-term plan. And so developing the partners that we have, training and educating them to be expert advisors, ensuring that we have marketing material to market what we do, but also the initiatives that are in place. You will see that communications is an enduring theme of ours, but this is where a recent really positive development has been for us. We've been able to influence NHS England communications and engagement team to allow us in Armed Forces Health to have our own Twitter channel. Now that may be a very small thing, but in an organisation like the NHS, for us to have our own Twitter handle where we can directly market material that explains what's being done for our group, that's a real step forward, and it's one of which I'm really proud that we were able to influence. So all of this activity is really designed for us to become as effective as we can be in helping NHS England understand the needs of the armed forces community. And we're really lucky that we've got a lot of people, some of whom are veterans, some of whom aren't, and that blend is really helpful to deliver what's required for the armed forces community. For veterans and people who are ex-military, we'll never be able to do enough quickly enough, but the steps forward that are being made are really important and really positive. So the influence of what we can do is really helpful. If we can move to the next slide, Kate, I just thought I'd give you a quick overview, and everybody on this slide has consented to share their information as part of their role as expert advisors. But this sort of breakdown of the subject matter that we look at and where we've got expertise and lived experience, I hope just gives you a flavour of the sorts of things that we are developing in our lived experience, patient, families and carers PPV group. And it's great because actually it reflects the NHS England Armed Forces programme, but it also shows the influence that we've been able to bring to bear about the subjects that we think are important. And one of those things, and I'm absolutely delighted to see in the programme later, is in the area of addiction. And people tend to sort of box that with drugs and alcohol misuse, but actually gambling is another area where it's really important. So I'm delighted to see that we've got a session on that this afternoon. So that just gives you an idea of the numbers and the people involved across the piece for and what it gives is it gives the people in the armed forces team somebody who's an expert to go to if they've got a quick question that needs answering. So it's a really helpful asset, I hope, for NHS England Armed Forces in terms of how they deliver their work. The next slide, if I may, Kate, is really, I've talked about the NHS long-term plan. This is the Bible, if you like, for healthcare for the armed forces community. It's publicly available, and actually it's a really good document authored by the armed forces team with input from the patient voice group, and it identifies the 9 commitments that NHS England are making to the armed forces community, and you can see that there, and you can see you could get these slides after the event. And what I'm going to do now, if I may, is just talk about how that impacts for women. If I could have the next slide, Kate, that would be great. Now you've heard from Lauren about some of the things that have influenced the women's healthcare issues for women who serve and women who have served. And it's connected to historic terms of service, the requirement to leave on marriage, the requirement to leave on pregnancy, the challenges of being a military spouse and following the flag and the demands that are made on you. The lifting of the ban on LGBT personnel was very late in coming to the armed forces and led to some quite challenging issues for the LGBT community. And the youngsters amongst the audience today won't remember a time when there was no pension sharing on divorce, but in days of yore there wasn't. And so there's an issue around poverty, employment and housing that Lauren's alluded to, as well as the physical healthcare pathway, particularly with musculoskeletal issues. And certainly when I first joined, which I know is 100 years ago, but we were wearing men's kit. We were not properly equipped to do what was required of us even then. So there were issues associated with that. And I think it's fair to say that mental ill health has impacted. I certainly myself had a fairly substantive breakdown during my time in service for not being able to be myself because being gay was illegal. So there are things that impact there, and there's been discussion around sexual assault and sexual harassment, which has contributed to it. And I know that you'll hear from Paula Edwards later about some of the work that she's doing in that regard. So there are healthcare issues. The research that's being done is helping to identify those issues. So what I'd like to sort of finalise on looking at is what's being done for female veterans and women who serve and are serving now, is just to have a look at what we are looking at in NHS England to advance the cause. And Lauren alluded to the steering group that has been created, which has got a broad range of membership. It's working closely with the Ministry of Defence because of the in-service issues. It's working closely with the military charity sector and other wider charitable partners. And we're looking at things like prevention and health promotion. And again, many of us who served will know that, you know, hazardous drinking to some degree is part of the military culture. I think it's better, but it's an issue that needs looking at in terms of the prevention and health promotion agenda. Things like the maternity pathway, continuity of care, people on deployment, means that there are special issues that need addressing in the maternity pathway. And there's a military maternity voice programme being developed in Lincolnshire to look at the particular challenges for that. The mental health pathway, part of Operation Courage, but actually ensuring that women can access the services and that there are specific support services for women if they want a particular a female counsellor or something along those lines. We're looking at violence against women and girls as part of the broader health agenda. And again, much of this is around the women's agenda in the broadest sense of our society, but looking at sexual violence and assault. And interestingly, the existence of sexual assault referral centres, I don't think is particularly well known in the military community. And I'm talking about the serving military community here, that you can access those services even if you're still serving, but people don't know that they're available. And so we're working with the Health and Justice team to look at how we can get that information across to the serving community if they need it. We're looking at the criminal justice system, women in the criminal justice system. They're low numbers, but what are we doing to support them post-custody, and ensuring that we identify ex-serving women as a vulnerable group within the criminal justice system. We're looking at employment after service. Employment is an issue, and NHS England have their Step Into Health programme, which again is being run by a veteran, Debs Paneskis, and that is the NHS England pathway to employment, which helps people from the military community into employment. And again, Lauren's touched on it, but we've had a call for evidence for women's health by the government and DHSC. We also serve Lauren's piece of work, Paula Edwards' piece on no man's land, which is again excellent research. And there's more research coming for Commonwealth and BAME service personnel and veterans, and the same with LGBTQ. So there's an awful lot of really positive stuff going on in our organisation in NHS England, which is really good, and that's why I was very keen to get involved in this today to raise awareness of what the group does. But I couldn't finish without asking something of all of you. And for those of you that are serving or have served, please identify yourselves, however you choose to describe yourself, as a female veteran or an ex-serving person. be proud of it. Make sure that document it on your medical records. Make sure your GP practice knows that. Have a look at the Royal College of General Practitioners initiative to make GP practices veteran aware or veteran friendly, because it just helps get a fuller picture of healthcare for the individual patient. Take responsibility for your own healthcare. I know for the serving, everything is done for you, and it's a complete and utter volte-face when you leave, because you have to do everything for yourself, and that includes taking responsibility for your own healthcare. Understand what is available to you, what initiatives are there, how you can access them. And I'm talking about the accredited practices, the Veterans Trauma Network for service attributable injury. That doesn't mean combat injury, but service attributable discomfort, pain. The Veterans Covenant Healthcare Alliance, that's accrediting secondary care trusts, mental health trusts, ambulance trusts, to be aware and understand the challenges faced by the armed forces community. And finally, Op Courage. It's landed well as a title. The suite of services will be re-looked at and re-procured as a whole at the back end of this year, but understand what's available. And last but not least, see if you can join a patient group in your GP practice or your clinical commissioning group or your soon to be developed integrated care system, because it will give you a voice and actually what the NHS want to do and need to be held to account to do is to put patients at the centre of their commissioning. That's me, folks, as they say. Thank you for listening. Look forward to the panel discussion later. Thank you.